비트와이즈 최고 투자 책임자는 비트코인이 두 자릿수일 때, 즉 100만 달러 미만에서 산 것은 행운이라고 말합니다.
That $2 entry point would have looked pretty good at the end of the year. I think Bitcoin's going up to $200,000 this year, so you would have been sitting pretty. The reason for that, I mean, the fundamental reason for that is I think there's a demand-supply mismatch in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is growing up as an institutional asset. It's being vacuumed up by institutional investors, by corporations, and also by governments. There's just not that much Bitcoin to go around. But where I see this prediction looking real in the market, the way I can explain it to you, is this is the first major market pullback in history where Bitcoin has outperformed the equity index. If you go back to 2022, during that market pullback, Bitcoin was 3x on the downside of equities. If you go back to 2018, Bitcoin was a multiple of the pullback we saw in the S&P 500. This time, it's basically keeping pace, depending on when you measure the start and stop of this pullback. It may be outperforming. That tells me that there's a sustained fundamental bid for Bitcoin. And if we can get some normalization in these markets, I know that's a big if, we'll dig into when that might happen. But if we can get some normalization in these markets, I think that persistent bid is going to drive it back up to new all-time highs at 109. And then above that, and the next place I think it stops is 200K. I think we're going to get there by the end of the year. There are scenarios where the world enters a really challenging, sustained economic downturn and risk assets are downward weighted. There's a scenario where Jerome Powell actually drives us into a wall and doesn't play chicken and support the economy that would make that difficult. So, I wouldn't make the prediction if I didn't think it was north of 50. But it's definitely not 100. There's nothing certain under the sun. I will say I'm very confident that you're going to see a decoupling between Bitcoin and stocks over the next year. I think Bitcoin will strongly outperform the S&P 500 as it has in most years in its history. There's just a persistent secular bull market in Bitcoin. And I don't think there's anything about tariffs that's going to stop that. So north of 50, shy of 100. Depends on what you want to do with your portfolio. When you add gold to a portfolio, what you do is you keep the same return, but you lower your risk. When you add Bitcoin to your portfolio, you keep the same level of volatility, but you increase your returns. There's sort of two sides of the spectrum. When I think about it as a hedge, you know the old saying about gold, an ounce of gold has bought a good man's suit for the last 1,000 years, and it'll probably buy a good man's suit for the next 1,000 years. It holds its value versus physical goods. The problem with using that as a hedge in a portfolio, and I love gold, is if you put 5% gold into your portfolio, you've hedged 5% of your portfolio. What about the other 95%? The beauty of Bitcoin, because it's emerging as a store of value asset, the same way gold did for what it's worth in the 1970s when we got off the gold standard. You saw it went from $35 to $800. Bitcoin is in that same emergent phenomenon. Is you could add 2, 3, 4% Bitcoin to your portfolio and hedge the entire thing against the fiat debasement, excess debt, and loss of institutional trust that we're seeing in the market.
매트 휴거는 금을 포트폴리오에 추가하면 수익률은 유지하면서 화폐 가치 하락의 리스크를 줄일 수 있다고 하죠. 금의 가격과 화폐의 가치를 보면 역사적으로 증명된 발언이라고 볼 수 있습니다. 그리고 비트코인을 포트폴리오에 투자하면 이에 수익률까지 더해서 포트폴리오를 제외한 전체 자산의 해지 효과까지 볼 수 있다고 하는데요. 비트코인은 단기적으로는 변동성이 커 보일 수 있으나 장기적으로는 그 어떤 자산보다 패턴을 지켜가며 안정적인 모습을 보여주고 있다고 합니다. 이 또한 역사적인 사실이죠. 게다가 비트코인은 여태까지 역사적으로 전통 자산의 가격을 추종해 왔으나 요새 들어서 갑자기 디커플링 되는 현상이 굉장히 많이 보이고 있죠. 이는 비트코인이 탈중앙화 자산으로서 면모를 보여주는 의미 있는 움직임으로도 볼 수 있습니다. 하지만 제 채널에 등장하는 전문가들은 대부분 비트코인을 좋게 이야기해야 하는 위치에 있는 사람들입니다. 고객 자금을 굴리고 있거나 회사 자금으로 비트코인을 구매한 사람들이 많기 때문이죠. 시장에는 정답질은 없습니다. 그럼에도 많은 투자자들은 리스크를 감수하고 돈을 벌기 위해서 비트코인 시장에 뛰어드는 것이죠. 하지만 급등락하는 비트코인 시장에서 급등과 급락을 반복하는 차트를 보고도 개인 투자자들이 욕심과 공포를 떨쳐내고 평정심과 내 자산이 우상향을 하는 것은 말처럼 쉽지가 않으실 겁니다. 저 또한 전업투자자 생활을 오래 했지만 항상 좋은 자리를 기다리고 인내해야 수익을 조금씩 낼 수 있었습니다. 그래서 저희 앤드류 트레이딩 팀에서는 어떻게 하면 일반 개인 투자자들도 투자 시장에서 수익을 낼 수 있을까? 구독자분들께 어떻게 하면 조금이라도 도움을 좀 드릴 수 있을까? 고민을 하다가 구독자분들도 비트코인이 명확하게 상승 추세가 나왔을 때만 투자를 하실 수 있게 한다면 수익이 조금 나지 않을까? 라는 생각을 하게 되었는데요. 제가 전업 투자를 하면서도 개발자로 오래 일을 했기 때문에 저도 써볼 겸 유료 결제를 해서 결국 만들었습니다. 바로 비트코인이 정말 신뢰할 수 있는 상승 추세인 건지 횡보인지 하락인지 알 수 있게 도움을 주는데요. 지금 보고 계시는 건 비트코인 차트인데요. 제가 빨간색 네모 박스로 표시해둔 곳을 보시면 주황색 61선과 파란색 121선이 교차하는 구간에서 추세가 변동되는 걸 보실 수 있습니다. 실제로 지금 비트코인은 최근에 61선과 121선이 데드크로스 하방 교차하면서 조정이 나오고 있는데요. 제가 운영 중인 앤드류 관점 채널에서는 보시다시피 2월 25일부터 제가 줄 곧 비트코인 하락 관점을 제가 말씀드리고 리스크 관리에 대해서 말씀을 드렸고 많은 분들이 도움을 받으셨습니다. 물론 데드크로스가 난다고 해서 무조건 하락하지도 상승하지도 않습니다. 저희 앤드류 트레이딩 팀에서 개발한 알파빗 지표는 약 8개의 고급 추세 기준과 트레이더들의 노하우를 담아서 차트가 상승할 확률이 높을 때 신호가 나오도록 개발을 하였습니다. 그 결과 저희 전문 트레이딩 팀 또한 판단에 도움받을 정도로 만족할 만한 놀라운 성과를 보였습니다. 시중에 유료로 팔 수 있을 정도로 가치 있는 지표이지만 저희 앤드류 채널 영상을 시청해주시는 구독자분들께는 무료로 제공해드리기로 마음먹었습니다. 저 또한 며칠 밤새 테스트하며 어렵게 만든 지표이지만 구독자분들 성원에 힘입어 저 또한 도움을 받고 있기 때문에 어렵게 공유드리기로 마음먹었습니다. 초보자분들부터 경력이 오래된 트레이더분들까지 굉장히 큰 도움을 받을 수 있는 지표라 도움이 되실 거라고 자부합니다. 신청 방법은 하단 더보기란과 고정 댓글에 나와 있으니 많은 신청 부탁드리고 이번 하락장에서 모두 잘 살아남으셔서 좋은 성적 내시면 좋겠습니다.
So it's just a very efficient tool long term. Short term, less so. Long term, it's held up extraordinarily well for any multi-year period you look at. Oh, that would help prices up significantly and fast, and here's why. The U.S. already created a strategic Bitcoin reserve. It holds the Bitcoin that the government has held for about 10 years that it seized in the very early days of Bitcoin. It holds 200,000 Bitcoin. But the White House executive order on that said that the Treasury shall find ways to add Bitcoin to its portfolio. If the U.S. government starts aggressively buying Bitcoin, what do you think other governments around the world are going to do? I think there will be a cascade of purchases by dozens of countries around the world rushing to build their position in gold for the digital age, and that would drive prices perhaps above my target significantly. So I would note, it sounds crazy, but the U.S. government owns a whole lot of gold. If you look at the store value market, hard currency market, Bitcoin is $2 trillion, gold is $20 trillion. If you're 100% gold, 0% Bitcoin, you're not holding the market portfolio, right? You need to be at least 10% Bitcoin just to match what the global market is saying the store of value market is. So I don't think it's far-fetched at all to start acquiring Bitcoin. It is gold for the digital age. We're moving into a digital world. I think it's going to happen and it'll contribute to pushing prices higher. I think it would probably be public. I think they would be public about it, or you can trace the wallets, or you would see some activity. There may even be a piece of legislation that passes through Congress that requires the government to do this. There is a piece of legislation at Congress that would have them acquire, 1 million Bitcoin over a period of a number of years. So I think you'll be able to see it. I think you'll be able to know. But what I would really watch is, can it keep outperforming equities as equities fall? If we see continued volatility, but Bitcoin holds above its previous all-time high at 72,000, it's just an extraordinary show of strength. And it tells you clearly, in my mind, that once the broader market stabilizes, this thing is back up to all-time highs. Look, I think we're entering a fundamental era of crypto. It used to be true that crypto had a broad market beta. If Bitcoin rose, then a few months later, Ethereum would go up, and then a few months later, other altcoins would go up, and you just sort of move out the risk spectrum, and you'd see all tides rise. I think that was from a time when crypto was primarily speculative. I think we're moving into an era where crypto is primarily fundamentally driven. Bitcoin is being driven by the fundamentals of institutions, corporations, and governments acquiring it. What will happen to the other 100 altcoins depends on what we see from the fundamental activity in that space. Will Ethereum do well? It depends on how fast stablecoins and real-world assets grow. Will Solana do well? It depends on how that competes with Ethereum. I think you're going to see a wide dispersion of returns amongst those top 100 assets. I would even bet that 70 of them will trend towards zero, and maybe 20 of them will do okay, and then there'll be a handful that return multiples of where they are today. That's the market that I expect to see over the next couple of years.